12. Germany's Easter Sunday traffic jam. After the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, residents in East and West Germany were able to freely travel between the territories for the first time in decades, while awaiting the country's official reunification. Several months later, in April of 1990, Easter Sunday marked the first holiday with unrestricted travel across the border. As the weekend approached, traffic became congested at an unprecedented level as families traveled to visit relatives they most likely hadn't seen in a very long time. An estimated 18 million cars filled the roadway, which typically only saw 500,000 vehicles per day, resulting in lines of bumper-to-bumper traffic on major highways measuring up to 30 miles long. Altogether, these sections amounted to an estimated 260 miles of gridlocked cars. Gas stations along these busy stretches of road were overwhelmed by customers, with motorists waiting up to 4 hours for service at some locations. To combat the blockage, authorities urged people to stay home and rush cars across the border as quickly as possible, conducting only rudimentary checks. The backlog holds the Guinness World Record for the longest ever traffic jam when it comes to the number of vehicles that were involved. 11. Woodstock Traffic Jam. The 1969 Woodstock Music Festival in Bethel, New York drew hundreds of thousands of attendees to the Catskills region. For a 3-day period starting on August 15th, traffic along the region's major roadways reached a near standstill, creating a more than 20-mile line of stranded vehicles along the New York State Thruway. Additionally, there was a 17-mile-long backup along Route 17B. Having never dealt with a traffic jam of this magnitude, state troopers were overwhelmed and, to some degree, helpless to do much about the situation. Not wanting to miss the show, many travelers simply abandoned their cars and walked the rest of the way. But their problems didn't end there. Woodstock's organizers didn't anticipate anywhere near such a large crowd, and they were woefully unprepared for the influx of music fans that showed up. They ran perilously low on food and water, and the bathrooms were extremely overcrowded, and anyone hoping to use a payphone could expect to wait up to an hour. What made matters even worse was that heavy rain turned the property into a soft, muddy mess. A lot of people got sick during Woodstock, creating an urgent need for doctors, medical supplies, and emergency services. According to news reports at the time, many concert-goers fell ill from drugs, while others suffered from allergies, asthma, pneumonia, and other ailments. Ambulances that managed to circumvent the traffic jam were constantly busy, and local emergency rooms were filled to capacity. The area's healthcare infrastructure was built to accommodate a much smaller number of people, and it couldn't keep up with the amount of patients who needed medical care. The festival's medical officer, Dr. Donald Golddecker, chartered a 40-seat plane to fly in volunteer doctors and medical supplies from New York City. He specifically asked for doctors who were familiar with treating patients who were sick from drug use, as well as medications for relieving the symptoms of both physical and mental drug-induced illnesses, including tranquilizers and anticonvulsants. Despite all these setbacks and inconveniences, the state police reported that the situation was chaotic but fairly peaceful otherwise. In the end, many of the music festival attendees decided to cut their losses and abandon the area out of concern for their safety. And while 2 people lost their lives, the number of casualties was surprisingly low for the amount of chaos that transpired. 10. China National Highway Traffic Jam. One of the longest traffic jams in history occurred in August 2010, when traffic along China's Beijing-Tibet Expressway and National Highway 110 became gridlocked for a full 12 days. The 62-mile-long backup of vehicles inched along so slowly that many stranded drivers barely moved over half a mile per day, with some motorists spending as many as 5 days trapped in the traffic jam. In the years leading up to the historic bottleneck, traffic along China's National Highway 110 had grown by as much as 40% every year. The road wasn't designed to accommodate nearly as much traffic as it was receiving, and chronic congestion was an ongoing problem. The traffic jam was caused by an unusually high spike in traffic compared to the already overcrowded road conditions, as well as maintenance work, which further reduced the road's capacity by as much as 50%. Simply put, this combination of factors was a recipe for disaster, with the traffic volume exceeding the road's design capacity by more than 60%. Ironically, some of the roadwork that contributed to the traffic jam was being carried out in projects that were meant to ease road congestion. There was an especially high number of heavy trucks on the road during the incident. Many were carrying coal out of Mongolia, where coal production significantly increased in recent years. In the absence of adequate railway infrastructure for transporting goods through the region, the only option was to move the coal with the growing number of trucks that began to clog the highways. Authorities asked trucking companies to suspend operations or take alternative routes until the traffic jam was over. In the meantime, officials tried to move traffic along by allowing more trucks into Beijing. The traffic jam was an extremely inconvenient situation for nearly everyone involved, but for many locals living near the gridlocked highway, it was a money-making opportunity. Residents and store owners peddled bottles of water to stranded drivers at up to 15 times the normal price, while instant noodles fetched as much as 3 times their typical cost. 9. Deadly holiday delay. As travelers flocked to the Indonesian island of Java to visit their hometowns toward the end of Ramadan in 2016, traffic became bottlenecked near the city of Brebes, forming a line of congested vehicles measuring 13 miles long. At the time, temperatures in the region hovered at a sweltering 86 degrees Fahrenheit, creating dangerous conditions for the stranded motorists. Authorities set up a hotline for people to call in the event of a medical emergency, yet officials had no clear answers for how responders would even reach someone in need. With no room on the roads or at nearby gas stations, which were also overwhelmed by the traffic jam, the government admitted that it didn't have a realistic way of handling any calls for help. The jam lasted for at least 3 days, and a reported 12 people died from dehydration and exhaustion while stuck in traffic. According to the BBC, a majority of the victims were elderly. With around 250 million citizens, Indonesia is the world's most populous majority Muslim country. Traffic tends to become congested during Ramadan, especially toward the end of the holiday season. And while they're not always predictable or avoidable, authorities urge civilians to err on the side of caution. In a statement shortly after news of the 12 deaths broke, a government spokesperson reminded travelers to get enough rest and to take necessary precautions during road trips. 8. 2021 Suez Canal Traffic Jam. At 1,312 feet long and nearly 200 feet wide, the Ever Given is one of the world's largest container ships. While navigating northward through the Suez Canal on its way to Rotterdam in March of 2021, the vessel encountered high winds from a dust storm. The crew lost their ability to steer, and as a result, the Ever Given ran aground diagonally across the canal. Its bow became lodged in one of the canal's banks, while its stern narrowly avoided coming into contact with the bank on the other side. At the time, the ship was traveling in a convoy with 15 other vessels behind it. Traffic ground to a halt, marking the beginning of a traffic jam that grew to include 200 vessels and billions of dollars worth of goods. Within just a few days, the standstill had caused noticeable supply chain disruptions. While manageable, the impacts would be felt for months to come. To many, it served as an alarming wake-up call about how little it takes to disrupt shipping on a worldwide scale. Knowing the Ever Given couldn't remain stranded for long without causing a major global crisis, crews worked around the clock to dig it out and get it floating again while the entire world looked on. After 6 days, the container ship was freed, and it was hastily towed out of the way so that the massive backlog of waiting ships could resume their routes. 7. Sao Paulo, home of the world's worst traffic jams. Traffic congestion has been a major problem in the Brazilian capital of Sao Paulo for years, with regular traffic jams that occur on such a large scale that they make driving in Los Angeles during rush hour seem pleasant in comparison. On a typical Friday evening, the line of stop-and-go traffic moving along at a slow roll extends for up to 112 miles, with the line measuring as much as 183 miles long on especially bad days. It's become so commonplace that people are often forced to plan the rest of their lives around it. According to a commuter named Fabiana Crespo, who spoke with the BBC in 2012, she often spends upwards of 2 hours just to get across the city to work and home each day. She even claimed that she met her husband in a traffic jam. Sao Paulo experienced its longest ever traffic jam in 2013, when the already agonizingly long line of backed-up cars stretched on for 192 miles. Experts estimate that drivers spend as much as 1 month per year sitting in traffic, and the issue isn't only inconvenient, it also raises environmental concerns. One idea that urban planners have floated is the development of alternative forms of transit, which would at least mildly reduce the number of cars on the road. While authorities have made efforts to alleviate congestion and could arguably do more, car travel is an unavoidable staple of life in the city. It's not going to go away, especially since many Brazilians see owning a car as a proud marker of having achieved middle-class status. Alleviating congestion in any way possible, while accepting that driving in the area will never be convenient, is likely the most realistic way for both the government and civilians to cope. One effort that's been put forth to make driving less nightmarish came in 2005 in the form of a 24/7 radio station called Sul America Traffic Radio. Dedicated solely to reporting on traffic conditions, the station gives drivers real-time updates, along with the best alternative routes to take at any given time. It also functions as a place for frustrated drivers to call into and vent about their latest traffic woes. To keep its information as accurate as possible, the station deploys both a helicopter and road reporters during rush hours. 6. The deadly wait at Mount Everest. It's not unusual for people to die after waiting to reach the top of Mount Everest. It's also typical for a person to feel too sick or worn out to complete the descent. But the number of fatalities resulting directly from the long lines of climbers at the summit seems to be increasing every year as overcrowding worsens. Many of those who die are experienced mountain climbers who underwent intensive training prior to their ascent, and who would have survived if not for the deadly traffic jams they encountered. In some cases, climbers get tunnel vision. They become so determined to reach the summit that they endure the wait, sometimes ignoring their body's warnings that it's time to turn around and get back down to a safe altitude. This is understandable since, after all, it must be hugely disappointing to come that close to the finish line and fail to reach it. But those who take the risk sometimes pay dearly. In early 2019, a climber named Anjali Kulkarni got caught in a traffic jam near the mountain's summit. She waited a long time for her turn at the top and couldn't make the descent, even after training for 6 years for the expedition. Kulkarni died, while Sherpas carried her down the mountain. Just days earlier, several other climbers lost their lives for similar reasons. After waiting for 12 hours behind other climbers to reach the summit, 27-year-old Nihal Bhagwan was exhausted and his body shut down. 52-year-old Kalpana Dash and 44-year-old Robin Haynes Fisher also died while descending after waiting in dangerously long lines in Everest's notorious death zone. A 55-year-old American climber named Donald Lynn Cash collapsed and died while snapping photos of the summit, marking the accomplishment of a major bucket list item in one of the most tragic ways imaginable. 5. Furious Flasher. During a rush hour traffic jam in Las Vegas one evening in 2016, 2 vehicles being driven by a man named Adrian Rodriguez and a 32-year-old woman named Gina DeMarco collided on an off-ramp along Highway 95. At the time, Rodriguez had his family with him in the car. But that didn't seem to matter to DeMarco, who allegedly got out of her vehicle and began flashing and screaming obscenities at the group. Rodriguez filmed the bizarre encounter with his cell phone before DeMarco sped away from the scene. She turned herself into the police 6 days after the incident and was charged with indecent exposure, failing to report an accident, and failing to stop at the scene of an accident. Authorities also charged her with fraud after they found out that she had used another person's ID for an unlawful purpose, although they failed to specify whether this charge is connected to the car accident. Unfortunately, the outcome of the case is unclear. 4. Businesswoman meets bullet. After attending a court hearing in the Philippine city of Paranaque one afternoon in early 2016, a 66-year-old businesswoman named Yolanda Della Rosa Manatad got in her vehicle and began driving home. She may or may not have noticed that a man was following her on a motorcycle, but either way there was nothing she could do to get away from him when she got stuck in traffic. Witnesses reported seeing the man approach the passenger side window of the woman's vehicle on foot with a 9mm pistol in his hand. The suspect then fired a shot into the car. He then circled around to the driver's side, opened the door, and shot the victim again before getting back on his motorcycle and driving off. Manatad died from multiple gunshot wounds to her chest and back. The suspect was still at large when the story broke, and authorities had yet to determine a motive for the murder. They suspected that the crime may have been related to the court matter that Manatad had just finished dealing with. Either that, or it was related to other court complaints she'd filed against people resulting from her involvement in the money-lending business. It's unclear if the perpetrator was ever caught, or if investigators ever figured out his reason for killing the senior citizen. 2. Murray Traffic Jam. Northern Pakistan's mountainside resort town of Murray often attracts more visitors than it can accommodate, forcing authorities to limit how many vehicles are allowed to enter. In early 2022, more than 100,000 tourists flocked to Murray to catch a glimpse of the winter snowfall, and for some reason, authorities failed to regulate traffic. The streets became unbearably congested as a traffic jam formed on the outskirts of the town, and thousands of vehicles became stranded bumper to bumper. To make matters worse, a blizzard pounded the region, dumping 5 feet of snow over the course of just a few hours and knocking trees into the road. Many people abandoned their cars and sought shelter at guest houses or anywhere else that would welcome them. Others languished in their vehicles without much needed food, warmth, and medical care. Emergency responders got caught in the traffic jam and struggled to reach the scene. In the meantime, the military was summoned to Murray. By the time any sort of help arrived, 22 people had died in the disaster. Most of the victims froze to death, while some perished from inhaling toxic exhaust fumes that filled the car when snow blocked the exhaust pipe. In total, it took 2 days for the military to rescue all the stranded survivors and fully clear the roads. Many survivors were left wondering why authorities allowed the mass stranding to happen. They reported receiving no emergency weather warnings and said that they thought it was perfectly safe to travel to Murray. In response, Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan and the Punjab provincial government ordered an investigation into the ordeal to determine whether there was a failure to issue extreme weather warnings to the public or to regulate traffic coming into Murray. 2. Twerking causes traffic delays. Traffic on one of Russia's busiest highways ground to a halt outside Moscow one day in 2018, so a deputy's wife could shoot a music video in the middle of the road. Footage that went viral on social media showed 29-year-old Oksana Yakovleva, who goes by the stage name Yaksana, performing a choreographed twerking routine in a leotard with 2 backup dancers in the background. Behind the singer, an SUV can be seen blocking the middle lane of traffic on what's known as the Moscow Ring Road. Yaksana posted the video on Instagram, along with a caption about how filming it gave her the jitters. She also claimed that her cameraman was almost run over. While the footage generated mixed reactions, the Moscow police made it clear that they were less than entertained by it, announcing shortly after the clip appeared that they'd filed a traffic violation report against Yaksana. A lot of motorists were visibly and audibly annoyed by the disruptive video shoot as well, and they showed their frustrations by honking their car horns. Also among those who weren't particularly pleased with the stunt was Yaksana's husband, Moscow Region Legislative Deputy Alexei Yakovlev, who said that he planned to scold his wife upon returning from a trip out of town. 1. Krispy Kreme chaos. When Scotland's first ever Krispy Kreme opened in Edinburgh in 2013, people flocked to the store in their vehicles and on foot. A line of pedestrians formed around the building, with people waiting in the darkness and the freezing cold for the doors to open. Meanwhile, the mile-long line of cars waiting to go through the drive-thru stretched into the road, causing traffic to become slow and backed up. The congestion continued for several days as customers waited for hours to get to the window. Traffic conditions became so bad that police were called in to prevent the situation from reaching a crisis point, and they advised the public to avoid the area altogether if possible. And they weren't the only ones getting annoyed by the situation. Health advocates expressed disgust at the long waiting times that people were willing to endure to get their hands on some fattening American donuts. In a seemingly concerned yet snarky statement, National Obesity Forum spokesman Tam Fry said, "If Edinburgh is so overweight today, then it'll certainly be obese by tomorrow." Law enforcement was less critical of the store, especially after the staff thanked them for their hard work managing the disrupted traffic with boxes of free donuts. And judging by how the store brought in a record £60,000 during its first day of operation, it's pretty clear that not everyone agreed with the naysayers who snubbed their noses up at the admittedly fattening yet delicious American treat.
Number 17. Disagreement between strangers turns deadly. In late March of 2022, an altercation broke out between a woman and two others outside a 7-Eleven store in Tucson, Arizona. And at some point, the woman got into her car and mowed the pair down. 79-year-old Anthony Ames died, and the woman he was with, Joy Roman, sustained serious injuries. But instead of facing the consequences of her actions, the suspect fled the scene on foot. Roman later told local station KVOA that the last thing she remembered before blacking out was a tire coming at her face. She suffered a broken pelvis as a result, as well as several broken ribs and facial bones. Police arrested the suspect, 20-year-old Elaine Vernette Boone, about 2 weeks after the deadly hit-and-run. She was booked on several charges, including aggravated assault with a dangerous instrument and second-degree homicide. Roman was particularly disgusted by Boone's ear-to-ear grin and her mugshot. During her interview with KVOA, the victim said that she hoped that the young woman got what she deserved for her actions. And according to state records, Boone was convicted of negligent homicide and is now serving a 2.5-year prison sentence. Number 16. Strip club shooting. At around 11 p.m. on December 30th, 2021, a woman who'd just left the Centerfolds nightclub in Chico, California, re-entered the building and asked employees to call the police. And when they asked her to explain, she said her friend had been shot. Butte County deputies arrived to find 21-year-old Alicia Flores suffering from multiple gunshot wounds, including one to the head. Employees had tried to perform CPR on her while waiting for help to arrive, but they were unable to save her. Just an hour earlier, Flores had been seen entering the club with 29-year-old Fernando Palinares and his girlfriend. The girlfriend was still on the scene, but Palinares was nowhere in sight. But inside his SUV, police found multiple fired and unfired 9mm rounds. Deputies later found Palinares walking along a roadside. He claimed that he'd been home that night and was just out for a walk, but his story wasn't believed. Authorities charged Palinares with murder and 2 weapon-related counts. And while searching a field near the strip club, they recovered a gun that they say he used to kill Flores. At the time of the shooting, Palinares was out on parole for the stabbing of a rival gang member back in 2012. He'd been released from prison just 7 months earlier in May 2021. And according to the most recent available updates on the case, Palinares was slated to go to trial in June of 2023. Number 15. Hotel Face-Off. What began as a verbal confrontation quickly escalated into a terrifying act of violence outside an Arkansas hotel in early June of 2023. Shortly after midnight, Fayetteville police responded to multiple reports of gunfire at a Quality Inn. Witnesses told officers the two men were arguing in the parking lot when the fight became physical. One of the men, later identified as 25-year-old Landian Markey Wright, allegedly knocked the other participant unconscious and continued to hit him after he fell to the ground. Bystanders intervened, at which point the attacker went to his room. But moments later he emerged with a rifle and shot at one of the Good Samaritans from an outdoor stairwell. The bullet struck several vehicles and a trash can, but no gunfire-related injuries were reported. Responding officers went to Wright's room, where they discovered that he'd put the rifle in a suitcase and changed his clothes. He was then taken into custody without incident and was cooperative during questioning. Wright is currently behind bars on $750,000 bail at the Washington County Jail on suspicion of attempted murder, committing a terroristic act, and 4 counts of first-degree criminal mischief. Number 14. Attack at Dawn. 18-year-old Naomi Irian disappeared from a Walmart in Fernley, Nevada during the early morning hours on March 12, 2022. She was waiting for a shuttle to her job at around 5 a.m. when suddenly she vanished. Her abandoned car was found 3 days later in an industrial area nearby. Surveillance video reportedly showed a hooded man, later identified as 41-year-old Troy Driver, circling Naomi's vehicle before forcing his way in through the driver's side and speeding off with Naomi in the passenger seat. Acting on a tip several weeks later, police discovered Naomi's remains in a shallow grave at a remote mining site in neighboring Churchill County. Sadly, she died from multiple gunshot wounds to the head and chest. Driver was charged with a slew of crimes, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, assault, burglary of a motor vehicle, robbery with the use of a deadly weapon, and destroying evidence. And according to prosecutors, he tried to conceal his alleged crimes by disposing of his truck tires and destroying Naomi's phone. Driver ended up pleading not guilty to the crimes he was accused of, and as of now, the case is ongoing. Number 13. Deadly Donuts. A teenager named Jolissa Hernandez was drunk at 5 a.m. one day in 2022 when she decided to do donuts in the parking lot of a grocery store in Willis, Texas. She had 2 friends in the car with her when she performed the burnouts with her Toyota Corolla. But unfortunately for everyone involved, the light-hearted fun took a deadly turn when the vehicle struck a wire supporting a utility pole and flipped onto its side. Garrett Spry was thrown from the car and died, while the other passenger survived with injuries. Hernandez, however, reportedly emerged from the ordeal without so much as a scratch. While investigating the scene, police reportedly found open containers of alcohol inside the car. They then obtained a warrant to perform a blood draw on Hernandez, who had a blood alcohol content of 0.107. Authorities tracked the purchase of the booze to a nearby gas station and arrested the clerk for selling alcohol to someone under the age of 21. Meanwhile, Hernandez was booked into the Montgomery County Jail on suspicion of intoxication manslaughter, which can carry a sentence of up to 20 years in prison. She was convicted of the charge and was sentenced to 120 days in jail, followed by 10 years of probation, and she's also required to use an interlocking device on her car to prevent her from driving drunk. In this particular case, prosecutors consulted the victim's family in their efforts to work out a plea agreement that was both appropriate for the crime and which had the approval of Garrett Spry's loved ones. But this isn't always the case, and a victim's family often feels let down by the justice system. And of course, the court of public opinion wastes no time making its consensus crystal clear. Number 12. Opportunist targets unsuspecting teen. 18-year-old Kelsey Smith had just graduated from high school and was looking forward to starting college in the fall when she and her boyfriend made plans to celebrate their 6-month anniversary over dinner in 2007. Shortly before their date, on the evening of June 2nd, she stopped at a Target store in Overland Park, Kansas to buy her boyfriend an anniversary gift. She called her mother while she was in the store, but she never returned home or showed up for the dinner date. Knowing that something was seriously wrong, her family reported her missing and an investigation was immediately launched. About 4 hours later, Kelsey's car was found abandoned in the parking lot of a mall, which is located just across the street from the Target store. Her belongings were inside the vehicle, leading police to suspect that she'd been kidnapped. Surveillance footage showed a man following Kelsey around the Target store, then forcing her into her car at 7:10 p.m. 2 hours later at 9:17 p.m., the male subject parked the car outside of a Macy's store and fled the scene on foot. Authorities released a video clip to the public in hopes that someone would be able to identify the suspect. 4 days later, after struggling to get Kelsey's cell phone data from her provider and finally convincing the company to hand it over, the information led investigators to Grandview, Missouri, roughly 20 miles from where she was abducted. Her body was found in a wooded area next to Longview Lake, and it was later determined that someone had strangled the young woman to death with her own belt. The same day, someone called law enforcement and said that the man in the surveillance footage resembled her neighbor, Edwin Roy Hall, who goes by the nickname Jack. And when authorities showed up at his house, he was getting ready to leave town with his wife and son, supposedly for a vacation. During questioning, he admitted to being a target but denied approaching Kelsey. But police knew that was a lie when his fingerprint matched a print that was left inside the victim's car. Hall was charged with multiple crimes as a result, including aggravated kidnapping and premeditated first-degree murder. He took a plea agreement in order to avoid the death penalty and pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a sentence of life without parole, plus an additional 47 years. Following the tragedy, Kelsey's family pioneered an ongoing movement to create new laws that would require phone companies to provide timely location information in the event of an emergency. Number 11. A deadly obsession. 29-year-old Patrice Wilson had just finished working the night shift at a Detroit hospital in May 2023 and was about to drive home when a man in a blonde wig abducted her at gunpoint. The culprit then forced Patrice into her own car and sped off. Police identified the suspect as the young woman's ex-boyfriend, 36-year-old Jamia Miller. Shortly after the kidnapping, Patrice's mother told Click on Detroit that her daughter was trying to get away from Miller because he was toxic. Relatives claimed that Miller was the subject of a viral TikTok video from 2021 that showed a man trying to break into Patrice's home. In the footage, which was captured by a doorbell camera, a man wearing gloves and a mask could be seen approaching a home and tugging at the door handle while trying to cover the camera lens. A woman behind the camera could be heard saying, "Jamia, are you breaking into my house? Are you serious?" The man kept tugging at the door and said, "Why would I break into your house?" At which point the woman questioned why he was at her front door wearing gloves. After learning of Patrice's abduction, authorities issued an alert to the public describing Miller as armed and dangerous. He was still at large the next day when Patrice's body was found in the trunk of an SUV outside her apartment complex in Novi, and unfortunately, she'd been fatally shot. Miller was taken into custody the following day. He was charged with a laundry list of crimes, including first-degree murder, felony murder, carjacking, armed robbery, felon in possession of a firearm, and 5 other gun-related felony counts. Miller has yet to be sentenced, though, because the case is ongoing. Number 10. Serial killers' parking lot slayings. A 23-year-old dance instructor and single mom named Diane Cusick left her Long Island, New York home one evening in February 1968 to shop for a new pair of shoes. But she never returned, prompting her concerned parents to go looking for her. They found her strangled to death in the back seat of her car outside of a shopping mall in Valley Stream. Her mouth was covered with duct tape and her hands were bound. Sadly, though, the investigation failed to turn up any useful leads and the case went cold. In 2021, the Nassau County Medical Examiner had evidence from the crime retested for DNA, and it generated a profile which matched to a convicted serial killer named Richard Cottingham. Known as the Torso Killer or the Times Square Killer, Cottingham was already serving time for killing and dismembering several victims in New York and New Jersey. Before he landed behind bars, he was a married father of 3 who lived in Lodi, New Jersey, and worked as a computer operator in Manhattan. Cottingham rented an apartment near his workplace and told his wife that he worked overnight, but in reality he was on the prowl for female victims to assault and kill. He targeted mostly prostitutes, but was an opportunist opportunist who often acted on impulse, which meant that no woman was truly safe. He was finally caught in 1980 after workers at a hotel in New Jersey overheard a woman screaming from inside a room. Investigators soon connected him with the murders of 4 other missing women, and Cottingham was convicted in all 5 cases despite his claims of innocence. He received multiple life sentences, ensuring that he'd never step foot outside a prison again. One of these first 5 cases was the 1976 murder of a 26-year-old X-ray technician named Mary Ann Carr, who was found beaten and strangled in a motel parking lot. Detectives suspected that Cottingham had other victims, but it took years for them to link him to more murders. In the early 2000s, a keen-eyed detective named Robert Ancelotti zeroed in on Cottingham as the prime suspect in several unsolved cases. The circumstances were much different than the serial killer's known crimes because the victims weren't prostitutes and they weren't dismembered. But over a several-year period, Ancelotti built a rapport with Cottingham, giving him special treatment in hopes that he'd open up about some of his other crimes. He eventually admitted to killing several women, whose families agreed to forego having the cases prosecuted, since Cottingham was in prison for life anyway. Ancelotti made this request because Cottingham hated media attention, and he knew the convicted killer might stop talking to him if his name was plastered all over the news. The detective also knew that there were likely more victims, so he wanted to keep Cottingham appeased for the time being. One of the cases Cottingham admitted to being responsible for was the 1967 murder of Nancy Schiava Vogel, a 29-year-old mother of 2 who was found strangled in her car in Ridgefield Park, New Jersey. In 2020, Ancelotti got Cottingham to confess to a particularly gruesome double murder that had sat at the top of his priority list to solve for years. At the time, he was about to retire, and he also thought the public deserved to know about the highly publicized cases. Cottingham was prosecuted and convicted of both murders, and the following year, his DNA was identified in Diane Cusick's case. After linking him to Cusick's murder, detectives took yet another look at unsolved homicides in New York and New Jersey, connecting him to 4 more cases from 1972 and 1973. As part of a plea deal, 76-year-old Cottingham admitted to murdering Diane Cusick in exchange for getting the other 4 cases dropped. On top of the sentences he was already serving, he received a sentence of 25 years to life. Nobody knows exactly how many women Cottingham has killed. He's claimed that he's murdered as many as 100 victims, and it's believed that he started killing as a teen. He's pushing 80 years old now and is reportedly in ailing health, so he'll probably take at least some secrets to the grave. But it also wouldn't be surprising if he made some deathbed confessions. Number 9. Hit-and-run suspect held responsible. On September 9, 2022, police in Everett, Washington received a call about an SUV blocking the entrance to a parking lot. Officers arrived to find a woman passed out behind the wheel of a Ford Escape with drug paraphernalia in her hand and suspected fentanyl in her possession. While examining the vehicle, they noticed damage consistent with that of an SUV involved in a hit-and-run weeks earlier. There was also blood on the front passenger side corner of the car. The first 3 numbers and letters on the license plate matched with a witness's memory of the hit-and-run suspect's license plate. And when shown a lineup of photos, the witness identified with 90% certainty the vehicle's owner, 32-year-old Amber Conaway, as the person he saw fleeing the scene of the hit-and-run. 80-year-old Patty Oman had been fatally struck by an SUV while walking home from buying some lottery tickets. According to the witness who helped identify Conaway, the driver got out of their vehicle and briefly glanced over at Oman before fleeing the scene. He said the suspect had an annoyed expression on their face and left without rendering help while he dialed 911. And unfortunately, Oman died in the hospital 4 days later. Police had also received several tips pointing toward Conaway as the owner of the vehicle in question, which they posted photos of online along with an appeal to the public for information. In the end, Conaway was charged with 1 count of hit-and-run fatality. However, the current status of the case is unclear. Number 8. Romantic date interrupted by murder. In early 2023, 29-year-old Eric Aguirre made plans to meet with a woman from a dating app at a restaurant in Houston, Texas. Upon arriving, he was told by a man claiming to be a parking attendant that he had to pay $20 to park. The attendant told Aguirre that as long as he returned to the parking lot with his receipt, he'd get his money back. So Aguirre withdrew $40 from a nearby ATM for both his and his date's vehicles, and they went inside to eat. They were about to sit down when an employee approached Aguirre and told him that the man claiming to be a parking attendant was a scammer. Aguirre told his date he'd be right back and left the restaurant. And when he returned a few minutes later, he said that he'd intimidated the scammer and that everything was fine. However, he seemed uneasy, and suddenly he decided that he wanted to eat elsewhere. The woman was shocked the next day when she found out that police were circulating her and Aguirre's photos online in an attempt to identify and question them in connection with a fatal shooting. Elliot Nix, the phony parking attendant, had been shot from behind while Aguirre was outside the restaurant the previous evening. Aguirre's date wanted to make it abundantly clear that she wasn't involved and didn't know about the crime until she saw it in the news, so she contacted law enforcement right away and cooperated with them throughout the investigation. Witnesses had reported seeing Aguirre retrieving his gun from his car and chasing after the victim. They said they heard a gunshot, then saw Aguirre calmly walking back to his car, putting his gun inside and re-entering the restaurant. In the end, he was charged with murder and now faces a possible life sentence if convicted. Number 7. The murder of Melissa Wit. As she prepared to attend a college class on the morning of December 1st, 1994, 19-year-old Melissa Wit asked her mother if she could borrow some money. They got into a disagreement, and it was still unresolved when Melissa's mom left their house in Fort Smith, Arkansas for work. Wanting to make things right with her daughter, she left Melissa a note saying to meet her at a bowling alley later that evening so they could talk. After going to class and working her shift at a dental office, Melissa drove to the bowling alley where her mother was in a league. She arrived sometime between 6:30 and 7 p.m., but never made it inside. Her car was found in the parking lot along with blood and signs of a struggle. The teen's keys and one of her earrings were also found nearby. Nearly a month and a half later, in mid-January 1995, a pair of hunters found Melissa's unclothed body in Ozark National Forest, roughly 45 miles from her home. Her decomposed remains were laid near a headstone-like rock. The hunters had been in the area less than a day earlier, and the body wasn't there the first time. So they immediately called law enforcement, and it was soon determined that someone had strangled Melissa to death. There's been speculation that Melissa was victimized by a serial killer who was reportedly in the region around the time of her abduction, but police don't think it's likely. No suspects have ever been arrested in connection with the brutal murder, but this isn't due to a lack of trying on law enforcement's part. For nearly 30 years, police have left no stone unturned and have followed every lead that's come in. In the meantime, Melissa's face was featured in an extensive billboard campaign in an effort to keep her at the forefront of the public's conscience. The case has also received widespread media coverage and is the focus of a podcast, a documentary, and even a book. However, police are still waiting for their smoking gun, which they believe could come in the form of a tip from someone who knows something but hasn't yet come forward. With the right piece of information, the case could fall into place. Number 6. Drug-fueled misadventure lands couple in custody. Around 8 a.m. one day in July of 2022, deputies in Pierce County, Washington responded to a report of a couple passed out in their vehicle in a Starbucks parking lot. They arrived to find a car running with both suspects slumped over in their seats. The vehicle's windshield wipers were going and the hazard lights were on as well. According to the Pierce County Sheriff's Office, the suspects were uncooperative when a deputy roused them and tried to ask questions. As a 32-year-old man in the passenger seat urged her to flee the scene, a 24-year-old woman in the driver's seat threw the car in reverse. She backed into a patrol car and then drove over a curb and around another patrol vehicle before turning onto the road. A deputy got in their car and followed the pair, who ultimately hit another vehicle and caused a 4-car collision. The male passenger attempted to flee the scene on foot, but was stopped in a parking lot by a Good Samaritan. Deputies then arrested a female driver at the scene. At the time of the crash, the suspects had 2 dogs in the vehicle with them. Both pets were ejected from the car, and only one was found. While running the vehicle's VIN number, police discovered that it didn't match the license plate and had been reported stolen weeks earlier. The female suspect and one motorist involved in the crash were hospitalized with injuries. After being released from the hospital, the woman was charged with first-degree assault, felony hit-and-run, vehicular assault, DUI, eluding a police vehicle, possession of a stolen vehicle, animal cruelty, and several drug-related counts. 2 bags of methamphetamine were also found in her possession at the hospital. The male suspect received similar charges, but the outcome of the case is unclear. Number 5. Nearly fatal mix-up. An innocent mistake took an almost deadly turn in April 2023 when a teenage cheerleader mistook someone else's car as her own in an Elgin, Texas parking lot. Heather Roth and fellow cheerleader Peyton Washington were being dropped off outside a supermarket by some teammates shortly after midnight when Roth approached what she thought was her vehicle. She realized it wasn't her car though when she noticed a man in the passenger seat and later said that she immediately began to apologize as she exited the vehicle. According to Roth, the man threw his hands up, then pulled a gun and immediately opened fire, striking both her and Washington. The girls then hurried back into their friend's car and fled the scene. They pulled over about 2 miles down the road after realizing that Washington was seriously injured and determining that the man wasn't following them, and by that point, Washington was throwing up blood. The team dialed 911, and the young woman was rushed to the hospital. She'd been shot twice and suffered multiple damaged organs, including her spleen, which was subsequently removed. Washington was hospitalized in the intensive care unit, but was in stable condition in the days following the shooting and was expected to survive. Roth sustained minor injuries and was treated at the scene. The supermarket manager witnessed the shooting, and the suspect's license plate was captured on surveillance footage. Police paid a visit to 25-year-old Pedro Tello Rodriguez Jr., who identified himself as an employee of the supermarket. He allegedly claimed he was sleeping at home at the time of the shooting. However, the police knew this was a lie. In the end, Rodriguez was charged with deadly conduct with a firearm and is being held on a $500,000 bond while his case works its way through the court system. Number 4. Mother of 4 meets foul play. 25-year-old Yolanda Bindix would have never abandoned her 4 daughters. So when she failed to return home from her shift at a family dollar store in Jamestown, New York one night in 2004, her family immediately knew something was wrong. Yolanda's brother was watching her kids that night, and before heading home, she called him and told him that she was going to pick up some milk on her way to the house. It was the last time anyone saw or heard from her. The next evening, her car was found abandoned at an Arby's parking lot roughly a half mile from her workplace. About a month after Yolanda went missing, her purse washed up onto the street from an overflowing storm drain following heavy rain, and a subsequent search of a storm sewer turned up her car keys. 2 years later, in August 2006, hunters found Yolanda's skeletal remains in a remote wooded area of Chautauqua County, but authorities never announced a suspected cause of death. By then, investigators had focused extensively on 3 particular persons of interest. One of them was Michael Watson, a Jamestown police officer who Yolanda reportedly had a relationship with. When Yolanda went missing, Watson failed to mention their history to detectives, who learned about the relationship from a family member. He claimed that he didn't say anything because it wouldn't have contributed any useful information to the investigation, but his silence set off red flags, prompting the FBI and police to investigate. While the investigations failed to turn up any leads in Yolanda's case, authorities charged Watson with stalking and various other crimes in connection with 3 other women. He lost his job and later sued the department, claiming that the charges were part of a ploy to destroy his reputation and career. Police also turned their attention toward Clarence Carl Cart, the father of Yolanda's youngest daughter. He was seen on surveillance footage leaving a gas station almost directly across the street from Yolanda's workplace at almost the exact same time she left the store. Cart was eventually ruled out as a person of interest, but investigators announced that they were revisiting the gas station sighting in 2022. This came after the formation of a cold case unit that shed new light on the case. Authorities also looked at a man named Darian Thomas, who Yolanda went to Niagara Falls with about a week prior to her disappearance. He was the father of her third daughter, and they were reportedly rekindling their relationship, although she'd also recently been seeing Officer Watson. Nearly 20 years later, the case remains unsolved. Nobody knows what happened after Yolanda left work, or how her car ended up in the Arby's parking lot. In her memoir, The Silent Conviction, Yolanda's sister Margaret Queen made it clear that many people have made up their minds about who they think the killer is, even if this person has yet to face justice in a court of law. The Chautauqua County Sheriff's Office remains hopeful that someone will come forward with the silver bullet of information that they need to solve the case. Number 3. The murder of Thomas Hawk. While responding to a call about a man down in a Youngstown, Ohio supermarket parking lot one evening in March 2001, police found 65-year-old Thomas Hawk Jr. on the ground next to a payphone, and apparently he still had the receiver in his hand. Hawk had been shot in the back of the head while making a phone call and was trying to talk but could only make choking noises. Emergency responders rushed Hawk to the hospital, which was just 2 blocks away, but doctors were unable to save him. Hawk was trying to call his son Brian when he was murdered. The call initially went through, but when Brian answered, the other end went dead. Brian later told the Sharon Herald that he recognized the number because his father had called him from it before. He knew it was a payphone, and he initially assumed that Hawk had run out of change. At the scene, responding officers found a spent round and a shell casing near the victim, as well as a bloody footprint. 2 witnesses said that they were on their way to class at a local college when they passed the parking lot and saw 2 men standing over Hawk. According to their accounts, one of the men ran over to a junky 90s model car and sped off. Hawk was one of the 34 people who were murdered in Youngstown in 2001. More than half of those cases remain unsolved, including his. The killer's motive also remains unclear to this day. Police found money in Hawk's pocket, which ruled out the likelihood of a robbery and suggest that they might have had some sort of disagreement that got out of hand. After losing his mom and 4 brothers in a house fire at a young age, Thomas Hawk essentially became a transient. He coped with the loss of his family by traveling all over the United States and picking up work along the way. At some point, he got so used to his lifestyle that he was unable to live any other way. And while he wasn't very involved in his kids' lives, he'd recently reconnected with Brian. Unfortunately, their time to rekindle their father-son bond was cut short in broad daylight, and nobody has come forward to say who's responsible. Number 2. Jane Doe on fire. San Diego police encountered a horrific scene shortly after midnight on January 24, 2000, when they found the body of a woman burning in a church parking lot. Someone had wrapped her in cardboard, secured it with rope, and chopped her hands off before setting her ablaze. And by the time officers arrived, the victim was dead and burned beyond recognition. Law enforcement speculated that the woman was likely killed elsewhere and dumped in the parking lot afterward. At the time, DNA technology was still in its infancy. Detectives relied on a sketch artist to draw a rendering of what the victim might have looked like before she was engulfed in flames. But unfortunately, the portrait failed to yield any helpful information. Nearly 2 decades went by before investigators sought the help of renowned genetic genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter, who'd helped identify the Golden State Killer. They'd already uploaded Jane Doe's DNA to a public database, but it only turned up matches for distant relatives. It was too big of a family tree for them to narrow down the victim's identity without help from a seasoned pro. During the investigation, a man who'd been adopted as a child named Glenn Stevenson matched with the victim as a half-sibling. Detectives tracked down a living sister in Michigan who shares a father with Stevenson named Kimberly Beach. The woman told them that she had a sister named Nicole Weiss, who fell out of touch with the family during the late 1990s after moving to the West Coast. Beach then gave a DNA sample, and the results proved that she and the murder victim were sisters. Nicole Weiss was 21 years old and lived about 2 hours away from San Diego in Los Angeles at the time of her murder, leading to speculation that her body may have been transported from there after she was killed. Authorities declined to elaborate on why she lost contact with her family, but Beach had good memories of her missing sister. She told CBS 8 that she suspected Nicole might have died, but that she never imagined that it would be so brutal. While one big part of the mystery has been solved, the other obvious question remains: who killed Nicole? After finally identifying her remains, cold case detectives appeal to the public for tips. They're hoping someone knows something and comes forward with information that could help crack the case. Number 1. Jerry Lynn Burns. The small community of Cedar Rapids, Iowa was both terrified and outraged by the murder of 18-year-old Michelle Martinko, who was found stabbed to death in her parents' car outside a shopping mall during the early morning hours on December 20th, 1979. She'd been stabbed at least 8 times, and her hands were covered in defensive wounds, showing that the young woman had fought for her life. Police quickly ruled out robbery as a motive and theorized, based on the gruesome nature of the crime, that the homicide was personal. The killer didn't leave any fingerprints behind. He cut his hand during the murder and left blood at the scene, but in the absence of DNA technology, this was a relatively meaningless clue. In other words, authorities had no physical evidence to help them identify suspects. Left with no other choice, they relied on the public to phone in tips while interviewing hundreds of people in an effort to narrow in on who the killer might be. But within a year of Michelle's murder, the suspect list had grown to include over 80 names. When DNA technology came along, detectives obtained the killer's profile from old evidence and began comparing it against a long list of possible suspects. At least 60 people were tested and cleared, and as the technology improved even more in recent years, law enforcement had the DNA sample reanalyzed and were able to narrow their pool of suspects to a very small number of people. Included in that group was 65-year-old Jerry Lynn Burns of Manchester, Iowa, whose DNA was obtained covertly in 2018 by an investigator who saw him throw out a straw at a restaurant. And lo and behold, it was a match. Burns claimed that he had no idea why his DNA might have been at the crime scene. He was a well-known and respected businessman in his community of 5,000 individuals, and people were completely shocked by news of his arrest. Michelle Martinko's parents likely would have reacted differently, but they both passed away long before Burns was brought to justice. He pleaded not guilty to the 39-year-old slaying and maintained his innocence all throughout his trial. But after deliberating for just 3 hours, the jury found him guilty. Burns was sentenced to life without parole and remains behind bars after unsuccessfully appealing his conviction. Would you rather have your car break down in a parking lot in the middle of nowhere while you're alone in an area with no cell phone service, or exit your local grocery store and discover that someone had crashed into your car and totaled it? Let me know in the comments below, and if you're new here, be sure to subscribe to the channel to be notified every time we post a new video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.